All right, should I go ahead and start, Jen?
Yeah, it's 11:08. He can pop in. I'll keep an eye out for letting him in.
Okay. Let me just make sure I share my screen correctly. All right, can everybody see my slides there?
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. All right, thank you all for being here today. I know we might be a little tired of Zoom, but I am really grateful for the chance to present to so many people in different parts of the country and from so many different disciplines. At the same time, I am in my home, so if you hear my dog barking, I apologize. It's probably just the mailman. I'm going to be presenting work that really defined my graduate experience, that has taught me so much and given me so many opportunities. And I'm really excited to share all of that with you. My dissertation in broad strokes is about how scarcity of important resources can impact eating behavior. To show you my evidence for this, I'm going to start off with some background, including some of the theory behind this work. I'll define the terms and constructs for you and tell you about how we measure them in our laboratory. Then I'll go into the 3 studies that make up my dissertation, what I found in each, and bring it all together at the end for a general discussion. I do want to mention a few things before we get started. Whenever I tell people that I study eating behavior and obesity and even poverty, people tend to get just a little uncomfortable. There's a lot of reasons for that, but largely it's because our society still has a lot of prejudice about people with obesity and people suffering from poverty. What I want to say about that in the context of this work is that what is healthy from one individual to the next is incredibly different and cannot be drilled down to one number on a scale, a food label, or a bank account. My goal here and in all of my work is to understand how the environment might influence behavior broadly so that all of us can have the information that we need to build an environment that supports health and well-being, whatever that might be for each individual person. Eating is and should be an incredibly important and joyful experience, and I never want my work to detract from that. And I have a slide at the end to honor that, so stay tuned. So to start off, financial scarcity is having fewer financial resources than you think you need. This can be a bit subjective, but to measure this objectively, there are a few options. Now, I have pre-COVID rates on this slide. All of the data collection that I will be discussing was completed in February of 2020, so prior to any lockdowns in the Western New York area. You can assume that COVID has made these rates higher as they all tend to track along the state of the economy. So to measure household resources, you can ask people for household income and household size and then put that into context by comparing it to the federal poverty line, which is an estimate of the minimum amount needed for basic survival. This can be a little difficult though, because a lot of people do not like to share their income. Another approach is to ask people if they've received government assistance over a particular period of time. This can be useful because it's quicker and when it comes to screening, and there are strict income criteria to qualify for these programs, and people typically do not seek them out unless they truly have a need for them. Finally, though not a measure of poverty itself, one aspect of living near the poverty line is food insecurity, which is a consistent worry or concern about one's ability to obtain an adequate supply of nutritious food. Food insecurity can be measured in individuals or at the household level. When we measure food insecurity, we will get a snapshot of where people tended to fall, usually in the last month. But keep in mind that one of the hallmarks of poverty or near poverty is an inconsistency of resources. So individuals and families will bounce around these categories throughout the month and throughout the year, depending on a lot of other factors. Food insecurity can occur with or without hunger. It is associated with obesity in adults and children, but in its most severe form, food insecurity with hunger, it's associated with undernutrition and less adiposity. This is rare in the United States, at least for the people who participate in these studies, which is many people. In either case, food insecurity is a risk factor for numerous diseases, including obesity, protein energy malnutrition, and a host of others. So speaking of health, socioeconomic broadly is linked to both lifespan and disease burden in the United States and all over the world. This has been the case for generations. While we spend a lot of time talking about poverty specifically on the left-hand side of this figure, this graded relationship is present across the income spectrum. It's simply more severe at the lowest levels of income. Obesity is thought to be one of the driving mechanisms for this. There's also a relationship between childhood poverty and adult obesity, particularly among women, which is not fully explained by childhood obesity or adult socioeconomic status. To look at this relationship between poverty and obesity, I started from an ecosocial perspective, which is a focus on how sociopolitical factors affect health by looking for pathways of embodiment, or how we biologically internalize our positions in society. The goal, of course, being that if we understand these pathways, which are very complex, we'll know how best to intervene to even the playing field and give everyone an equal shot at well-being and longevity. There are numerous pathways for socioeconomic status to increase one's risk for obesity. Energy-dense foods in the United States tend to be less expensive and more shelf-stable, both of which are important when you are stretching your limited resources to feed a family. There's also often differences in access to and quality of grocery stores and fresh fruits and vegetables based on the affluence of the neighborhood. What I'm particularly interested, though, are direct changes in eating behavior based on the available resources. Our brains are set up with certain drives and urges to consume. Some of that consumption is what keeps academic life going. Most of it, however, is to keep us alive and well, and to give us a lot of energy to survive for a long time, even more than we really need. That drive to consume energy in a resource-rich environment has led to positive energy balance and thereby obesity. In our lab, we're interested in individual differences in these drives to consume, what influences them, what weakens or strengthens them, and how this may influence energy intake and thereby disease risk. To do this, we use an operational definition of the relative reinforcing value of food. The relative reinforcing value of food is the amount of work one is willing to do in order to obtain a portion of food relative to another reinforcer. This was originally conceptualized by Skinner, who trained animals, usually rats or mice, to press a lever for access to food. Food is the reinforcer. When we study human behavior, we're not allowed to lock them in boxes. So instead, we have them click a mouse, a computer mouse, but pun intended. And in our laboratory and in others, participants are asked to sit at two computers and are told that they can click the mouse button for food on one side and an alternative activity on the other side, something simple and enjoyable like reading magazines. This varies between experiments, but in most cases, the foods are high energy density snack foods in portions of usually around 100 calories. Participants pick their food for this task, the most beloved being M&Ms, obviously. From there, the participant chooses which reinforcer they would like to work for. They can switch back and forth or stick with one, and the research assistant brings in the food when they've earned a portion. Now, I'm going to show you what this looks like. On each computer, they're presented with these nice colored shapes, and when they click the mouse button, the shapes and colors rotate and change. This is intentionally set up like a slot machine. They keep clicking until they get a match, which earns them 1 point. Once they earn 5 points, they earn a portion of food. As participants move through the task, it gets progressively harder, requiring more and more mouse clicks to earn food. Most animals and most people will put in some work for food, particularly if they're hungry, but there are individual differences in how much work people will put in for food. A wealth of past research has shown that people with a greater reinforcing value of food, that's people who will play the task for longer and click the mouse more times, also tend to eat more when they're given free access to foods and are more likely to have obesity. This has been shown in adults and children. It's quite stable within individuals, but can be altered by hunger and food deprivation and restriction. Before we started this work, one study had shown a relationship between financial scarcity, in this case, lower income, and the relative reinforcing value of food. This study also showed that the relationship between income and body mass index was mediated by the reinforcing value of food in adults. Alongside the work that I'm presenting today, I also analyzed some data with Doctors Temple and Kong and showed that food insecurity is associated with a greater reinforcing value of food among pregnant women. I also analyzed a separate data set of adolescents and showed that income was related to the reinforcing value of food in this age group as well. Laboratory experiments looking at the effect of scarcity on the reinforcing value of food have been minimal. One study looked at the effect of an imagined financial crisis and found that participants in that group increased their food demand or the price they would be willing to pay for a portion of food, which is a similar construct to the reinforcing value. This study and those on the previous slides suggest that scarcity of resources might impact the reinforcing value of food, but more experimental evidence was needed to be sure. Switching gears a little bit here. So our brains have these drives and urges to consume calories to give us energy, both for the immediate needs and storage for later, but that's not the whole story. Our brains also have self-control, or a competing part of the brain that inhibits these drives to consume. This is how we stop ourselves from doing lots of impulsive things and instead plan for the future. This is a skill that also has individual differences and one that develops throughout childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood. One facet of self-control is delay discounting, which is the extent to which reinforcers lose their value the longer you have to wait for them. The further away something is in the future, the less value it has. When a person has a strong preference for immediate gratification, we might call them impulsive. To measure delay discounting, we ask participants to make choices between different amounts of money over different amounts of time. This is what it looks like. The participants are seated at the computer and are presented with a choice much like this. There's a lot more choices on the task, but I'll show you just a few to give you a flavor of it. If this choice were mine to make, I would probably pick tomorrow. Again, for me, one day is just not too long to wait for that much money. Jumping ahead, now we have a longer delay, a week, but still I would wait for that much money. Jumping ahead again, 6 months actually feels like quite a bit longer to me, but in this case, I would still wait. Still not too bad, I would wait. This is a tougher choice, but I would still wait. Now, to me, honestly, these do not seem very different. I don't think I would wait, which means we're getting close to my indifference point, the point where the two values are nearly equal. Now, just in case there are a few more future-oriented people in the audience, the task does go further out. For most of us, there does exist a point where waiting for a longer payout just doesn't seem worth it. So just as I demonstrated, the task moves through 6 delays. Within each delay, it titrates the immediate amount up and down until it zeroes in on an indifference point for each delay, or a point at which the immediate value and the delayed value are equivalent in the participant's eyes. From there, we plot the indifference points for each delay, and in our case, calculate the area under the curve for each participant. Area under the curve is reverse scored, so lower scores indicate more delay discounting. For example, if you were a person in the light blue here and you discounted very steeply, and the reinforcers lost their value more quickly, your area under the curve would be lower. Whereas if the reinforcers never lost their value, your delay discounting would be minimal and your area under the curve would be very high. Like the reinforcing value of food, there are individual differences in delay discounting. It's heavily linked to age, so children are terrible at this. This is my son on his 4th birthday being told he has to wait to eat his cake until after we sing. Telling a child to wait 2 minutes for something is a lot like telling an adult they have to wait 2 weeks, though this does depend on the adult. Delay discounting is also linked to hunger. Hungry people are quite impulsive. Delay discounting is also associated with greater energy intake and greater risk for obesity. Researchers have speculated that for people with high delay discounting, the immediate gratification of high energy density foods is just more tempting than the longer term rewards like better health and longevity. There's been a lot of inquiry into the effects of scarcity on delay discounting. It's associated with financial scarcity in adults, in children, and across the lifespan. So a history of poverty is associated with higher delay discounting in adults. There's also some experimental evidence for this, both in the natural environment and in the laboratory. In the laboratory, researchers have used rigged or sham games to create a financial loss for the participants, or use narratives to help the participant imagine a large financial loss. Both have been shown to increase delay discounting in the laboratory. Now, we know that both a high reinforcing value of food and a high delay discounting are predictive of greater energy intake. When they occur together, we call this reinforcer pathology. This idea originates in the drug abuse literature, but it appears to map on well to energy intake and obesity risk. People who are high on both of these are at a much higher risk for obesity. All right, now I'm going to switch gears again and talk a little bit about stress. Life is full of stressors or challenges or threats that disrupt our homeostasis and demand a response. Unlike our ancestors, we tend to worry less about attacking lions, but much more about the state of our finances. Financial scarcity is associated with greater psychological stress, and stress is associated with greater energy intake, as well as a shift in preferences for foods high in fat and sugar. This is sometimes referred to as stress eating. Stress eating is probably not a foreign concept to most people, and research has shown that increases in cortisol, which is a hormonal marker for stress, predict both increased caloric intake and that shift in preferences. There's also some evidence that stress increases the reinforcing value of food in some populations and increases delay discounting. However, stress eating research is nothing if not conflicted. Numerous studies have shown no effect of cortisol or psychological stress on eating behavior, and even more have documented important individual differences in these relationships, with some of the most important being binge eating disorder, chronic stress, and obesity itself. So bringing it all together, research up to this point suggests a connection between all of these constructs, but this is across numerous different samples and studies, typically in adults, generally cross-sectional, and some in sore need of replication. We know that some of the pieces fit together, but no study had yet brought them together to see how these relationships play out in the laboratory. So of course, I hoped to do just that. I had 3 aims for my dissertation. If you remember, I noted earlier that we had the least evidence for an effective scarcity on the reinforcing value of food, so I started there. Next, I examined this question I expanded this question to include delay discounting and development. Finally, I wanted to see how acute stress might fit into these relationships. This brings us to my first study, which was actually made up of 2 experiments. I'll refer to them as experiment 1 and 2. Across both experiments, our hypotheses were pretty similar. We used a variety of scarcity manipulations in the laboratory and wanted to find out if they affected the relative reinforcing value of food in our participants, who were adults. We also wanted to explore if food insecurity moderated these relationships. So in the first experiment, I recruited 25 adults, both males and females. We did not recruit for this, but we did measure food insecurity, and a little over a quarter of the sample reported it, which is actually a little high. Participants came in for 3 appointments and were paid for their participation at the end. In this experiment, we were interested in resource scarcity and time scarcity. There were 3 conditions, which I will explain in a moment. Every participant saw all 3 conditions on different appointments, and the order was counterbalanced. To analyze this, I ran repeated measures analyses of covariance with the 2 experimental conditions compared to control and controlling for covariance. This is showing you the flow of the appointment. In all of these studies, we could not let the participants know what the study was about because they might have changed their behavior. So we used misleading titles, filler tasks, and told them that the study was about something completely unrelated to obscure the research questions. In this case, we told them that the study was about mood. Participants came in 2 hours fasted and completed a filler task, and then started the reinforcing value task. I introduced the scarcity manipulation after they had completed the first 2 rounds of the reinforcing value task. In the control condition, I just popped my head in and asked if their monitors were working correctly. In the resource limited condition, I told them that we were starting to run out of food, but to keep playing, and I would let them know if we ran out. And in the time limited condition, I told them that we had a scheduling mistake, so they only had 5 minutes to complete the task. By the end of the experiment, they all thought that our lab was a complete mess, but I did debrief them at the end and tell them that it was all a sham. After that, after they were done with the task, they were given the opportunity to eat the food or take it home. They completed another filler task and then filled out surveys. When we looked at the results for those repeated measures and COVA, we found no difference between the conditions at all. It was a fun moment for me. But we had included that food insecurity scale in there because we suspected that a scarcity manipulation might affect some people more than others. When I included food insecurity as a between subjects factor, this pattern emerged. The y-axis has proportional responding. The adults reporting food insecurity shifted their responding away from the alternative and toward food when they were told that the food was running low. We did not see this pattern when we used the time limit. One thing I want to remind you of here is that there's evidence that people do something similar when they're under acute stress in the laboratory, shifting their preferences over to high fat, high sugar foods. This was part of what formed the early ideas for study 3. Okay, so we wanted study 2 to build on this, and we wanted to test a final scarcity manipulation. This one got at financial scarcity. Experiment 2 included 30 adults, half female, and a little less than a quarter reported food insecurity. They came in for 3 laboratory appointments, a control, a loss, and a gain. In this case, we had them play 3 altered versions of the Iowa gambling task. This task has been used a lot to measure risk-taking behavior and involves choosing between different decks of cards, winning and losing money as you go. We created a version of the game where the decks were quite literally stacked against them and they tended to lose money, another where they found they had very minimal losses, and the control where they tended to break even. It did matter how they played the game, and some were better than others at this, though performance did not differ based on food insecurity. Again, we did not tell them what the study was about. And again, the analysis was a repeated measures analysis of covariance, this time with all 3 conditions in the same analysis controlling for covariates. Again, here are the procedures from this study. They came in, once again, 2 hours fasted, completed a filler task, and then did the manipulated Iowa gambling task, whichever condition they had that day, order counterbalanced. They completed the reinforcing value task, ate the food, and took home any leftovers, another filler task, and then surveys. For the results, this is what we found when we just looked at the food secure participants. This is responding for each reinforcer with condition type on the x-axis and area under the curve for task responses on the y-axis. Higher scores mean more clicks. We see that when they won money, the food secure participants responded a little bit more for food. However, when we look at the food insecure participants, we see a fairly dramatic difference in responding for food in the loss and control conditions. We found no difference between loss and control here. However, the design of the manipulated games were not perfect. We did notice that some people actually also lost money in the control condition, which could explain the lack of difference here. But taking the results as they are, we interpreted this as evidence that food insecurity is really driving differences here. And the manipulation just allows us to see this. It was actually Dr. Epstein who suggested that the manipulation was really more of an intervention, and that gaining even a little bit of money served to alleviate the rise in the reinforcing value of food that food insecurity was likely causing. I walked away from these 2 experiments with good evidence that resources and financial scarcity affect the reinforcing value of food among those already suffering from food insecurity. This data formed the preliminary data for my grant, and along with my co-sponsors, Drs. Epstein and Temple, we pitched this idea to NIDDK that I would look further into this by adding in delay discounting and examining children and adolescents during potentially sensitive periods of development. I also suggested looking at stress as a mediator, and I'll talk more about that for study 3. So this brings us to study 2. Now study 2 and 3 came from the same experiment, but we did 2 separate analyses, one for reinforcer pathology and one for stress. For study 2, we wanted to bring in a life course perspective, which suggests that changes during sensitive periods of development may have a larger and not permanent, but a more difficult to change effect on the body and the brain. Indeed, much of obesity risk starts during childhood and adolescence. Many of our food preferences and habits are formed during childhood, and we certainly know that unfortunately many kids in the US still experience poverty. And as I discussed earlier, children who grew up in poverty have a higher risk for obesity in adulthood, even if they no longer live near the poverty line. So we selected 2 age groups for this, middle childhood and middle adulthood. There's many differences here besides the obvious physical ones. Their brains are quite different overall, and particularly they are very likely to be different in terms of delay discounting. Most adolescents will be much better at considering and planning for the future compared with children, but this part of the brain will not be fully developed until adulthood. There's also huge differences in independence at these ages. The adolescents will have much more of an ability to get their own money and more sources of food than the children. Oh, sorry. Too soon. Okay, there's also some differences in terms of how they experience financial scarcity. There's a lot of evidence that Parents work hard to shield their children from experiencing food insecurity. They will cut their own portions of food before they allow their children to feel hungry. However, adolescents do experience food insecurity directly, and this doesn't always line up well with their parents' reports. We know that young children understand money, and at least some of them do understand and experience food insecurity, but there's a little less evidence for this. All of these experiences are deeply connected to the parents in this situation. However, the effects on behavior and reinforcer pathology are generally unknown. So to find out if financial scarcity affects reinforcer pathology at these different age groups, we recruited a stratified sample of children and adolescents, along with one parent each, and put them through another within subjects experiment using the financial gains and losses manipulation from the previous experiment that I described. I also wanted to know how chronic financial scarcity, the household resources, and particularly food insecurity, may interact with the manipulation in the laboratory. So the sample was also stratified by household financial resources. This is what our sample looked like. I don't expect anybody to read all of this. I'm just going to highlight a few things for you. Just to be clear, we recruited families, not siblings. So we had adolescents and children along with one parent each from separate families. The sample was with and without chronic financial scarcity. We defined this as receipt of assistance or report of food insecurity. Assistance in this study was reported by the parent and included benefits of the SNAP program, the WIC program, the school lunch program, if the school was not already providing this to everyone regardless of household resources, and donations reported by the parent from any local food bank. We used assistance for our recruiting, but if anyone then came in and reported food insecurity, we moved them into the chronic scarcity group. The chart in the upper left-hand corner shows our two criteria for chronic scarcity, which did overlap, but not for everyone. We attempted to balance the sample by age and gender, and we also targeted our recruitment so the groups were relatively balanced in terms of race and ethnicity. The chart in the lower right-hand corner shows you the racial and ethnic breakdown of the whole sample collapsed across parents and children. This is the flow of the study again, and it was pretty similar to the previous experiment. This is not everything we did, but this is what's relevant here. We used an adjoined room for this, so parents and offspring were close to each other, but were in separate rooms. All participants had the same progression through the study, but I did alter the delay discounting tasks so that the amounts were more appropriate for the age groups. And I also selected surveys that were age appropriate where we could. The participants came in 2 hours fasted, consumed a granola bar, this is to normalize their hunger, and completed a filler task and reported their hunger. Then they completed the manipulated Iowa gambling task, again, order counterbalanced, completed the delay discounting task, and finally the reinforcing value task. After that, they were given a chance to consume the food they earned or take it home, and they completed surveys. We had quite a few surveys spread across the 3 appointments, but the ones included in this analysis were food insecurity and some household demographics. In this study, I used multi-level modeling for dyadic data, which allowed me to look at the repeated measures, account for missing values, and control for the natural interdependence between parents and offspring. The covariates for each dependent variable, delay discounting, reinforcing value, and reinforcer pathology, which combines the two, was chosen based on the previous research. I did a number of different models for this study. I'm showing you the largest one here, and I'll draw your attention to a few things. I had parents and offspring in this study, but they were also split by offspring age. So in order to compare age groups, I had the main effect and the interaction of these variables in the model. Next, I had 3 conditions for this study, but to analyze the data, I simply took the total at the end of the manipulated Iowa gambling task on each appointment, which allowed me to use a single variable and account for the differences in how well they played the game. Finally, the largest interaction here in this model looks at the effect of game winnings between parents and offspring, between offspring age group, and between food secure and insecure families, controlling for everything above. For the results, I'll start with the age differences. For delay discounting, this is exactly what we would expect. Reminder here that this is reverse scored, so lower scores indicate more discounting and more impulsivity. So the children are the most present focused, followed by the adolescents, and the adults are the most future oriented. In the case of reinforcing value, we were surprised to see that the children had the highest reinforcing value of food, higher than both the adolescents and their own parents. Now, this combination of greater delay discounting and greater reinforcing value of food, hopefully you see where I'm going here, we have a higher level of reinforcer pathology among the children. Next, we wanted to look at food insecurity. When we looked at delay discounting, we found after controlling for age differences, a main effect of food insecurity. Across all the age groups, those with food insecurity were more present focused on the task, but there was no effect of the manipulation at all on delay discounting for anyone. The adolescents look pretty similar here, but this interaction was not significant. When we looked at the reinforcing value of food, however, we see a familiar pattern. Like in study 1, the only group affected by the manipulation was parents with reporting food insecurity. In this case, the effect was largely driven by parents of children. When we combine this all together into one model examining reinforcer pathology, a significant three-way interaction emerged between dyad role, parent versus offspring, food insecurity, and winnings on the game. Food insecure parents in our study showed greater reinforcer pathology after losing money compared with winning money. But these small amounts of monetary losses did not have an effect on the food secure parents or the adolescents or children. So to summarize, the children in this study were quite high in food reinforcer pathology compared to the other groups. We didn't look at this over time, so we can't know if this is a developmental phase or something about the kids in this study, but it's certainly worth investigating. Food insecurity was related to greater delay discounting in all age groups. Past research has shown similar findings, and it really makes sense to me that when you aren't sure if you have your basic needs right now, planning for the future does not make a lot of sense. Even though it's the parents that are experiencing food insecurity, the effect is strong enough to reach the adolescents and children in this case. Finally, food insecure adults respond to financial losses with an increase in reinforcer pathology, particularly parents of young children. I suspect that this is because the burden of feeding the child weighs more heavily on the parent when they're younger, which increases their own reinforcing value of food, perhaps. I did look at child reinforcer pathology to see if it was driving the parent's behavior, but we did not find any evidence for that. All right, so moving on to study 3. As I mentioned in the beginning, there's an expansive literature on the role of stress in poverty and in eating. I wanted to see if stress might be involved in the relationships here with financial scarcity and reinforcer pathology. The goal of this study was to assess those relationships, and if they were apparent, I wanted to do a mediation analysis to look at the pathway. Again, as I mentioned, this is the same experiment as the one I just showed you. It's a separate analysis, so it's from the same data set, same sample design. These are the methods that I showed you before, but there's a little bit more that we did. In and around those activities, I wove in measures of stress. So when they came in and ate that granola bar preload, they also completed a 10-minute relaxation period to normalize their heart rates and their cortisol levels. After that baseline relaxation and after they went through the manipulation, there was another 10-minute wait period before the saliva was collected, which is another reason we had those filler tasks. We also asked them about their feelings of tension and anxiety throughout the study as a measure of acute subjective stress. Finally, we measured continuous heart rate through the study to give us another biomarker of stress, this one in the central nervous system. For this, we took the heart rates from the relaxation period and during the task and found the max during those ranges, which is what we analyzed as our outcome variable. They also completed surveys, both parent and offspring, to report on the overall chronic stress level. We did not find much with that, so I won't be presenting it, but we did investigate it as a moderator. The analysis for the study really had two parts. The first was taking saliva samples and analyzing those for levels of cortisol. We did this using enzyme immunoassay kits. I won't get into all the nitty-gritty details here, but basically it's a very delicate process of putting saliva samples into these plates and using a series of chemicals to dye the cortisol and then passing light through them to measure how much of the dye is in each well. We required complete data from both parent and offspring for all 3 appointments, which is why the N is so much lower for cortisol than the other measures. Self-reported tension and heart rate were missing for some appointments, but we included all available data in the analyses. Every participant had at least 1 appointment with complete data for these. I had to include the pictures on this slide. Last summer, Dr. McKay, who's a professor at Buffalo State, generously agreed to teach me how to run the kits for our saliva samples. This happened when none of us had childcare, so my husband watched her kids along with our own so that she could train me. It was super fun. I highly recommend doing this sort of thing when there's a pandemic and you can get an entire microbiology classroom all to yourself. To analyze the data statistically, I again use multi-level modeling. For acute stress, the outcome was the levels for each of our measurements after the manipulation, controlling for baseline and our covariates. I didn't list them here, but the cortisol analysis did control for time of day and time between saliva collection points because cortisol naturally declines throughout the day for most people. Again, I'll start with some age differences. These are at baseline, and these are exactly what we would expect. The children have very low cortisol levels, which is typical for their developmental period, while adolescents are more similar to their parents. The adolescents look a little higher here, but this, again, was not significant. Similarly, baseline max heart rate is exactly where we would expect, with a steady decrease as age increases. Even the parents of the adolescents are a little bit older than the parents of the children, and their heart rates are just a little bit lower too. When it came to responses to scarcity, all participants in all groups had greater heart rates when they won more money, and there was a very slight increase in self-reported tension after losing money. For cortisol, though, we only saw results among food insecure parents. For this group, each dollar lost matched with an increase in cortisol, and winning money resulted in much lower cortisol for this group. Now, this relationship should look a bit familiar because it's very similar to what we saw for the reinforcing value of food. So as you can imagine, I was getting pretty excited at this point. So for our final analysis today, I wanted to complete this triangle and see if our markers of stress predicted a greater reinforcing value of food. So we're only looking at the dotted line here right now. For this, I again used multi-level modeling and created the same models I described in study 2, but this time, instead of including manipulated game winnings, I included the change in cortisol from baseline to right after the manipulation. I also did this for the other markers of stress, but I expected cortisol to be the one that would show the relationship. However, despite the similarity between the results in the two analyses, I found no relationship between any marker of stress and the reinforcing value of food. The same goes for delay discounting and thereby reinforcer pathology. Without the presence of this relationship, there was no reason to do a mediation analysis. Overall, we did find that multiple age groups reported increased subjective acute stress after financial losses, and for parents reporting food insecurity, this was accompanied by an increase in cortisol. We did not find evidence for an effect of acute stress on reinforcer pathology in this study. All right, to sum it all up, we replicated our previous findings among adults that those with food insecurity are sensitive to financial gains and losses and respond to financial losses with an increase in their reinforcing value of food. We did not see this in children and adolescents, which may be because in this case, they were not the ones experiencing food insecurity. Anyone who wants to investigate that question will need a much bigger sample because food insecurity is thankfully much more rare than adult food insecurity. It's much more rare in children than in adults. Food insecurity was associated with greater delay discounting, and this spanned all age groups. I suspect that the effect of food insecurity was so strong that the small financial gains and losses in our manipulation just didn't have much of an effect on it. Food insecure parents had an increase in cortisol following financial losses, but this did not correspond to a greater increase in reinforcing value of food. And this may have been because of a lack of power, since we did have fewer people with cortisol data. However, as the evidence stands, it may simply be that these two responses occur side by side, but do not influence one another. So what should we do next? First, we need a longitudinal study with a larger sample to look into this in more detail and confirm the findings, particularly how they may pertain to development. I know a few people have studies like this in the pipeline, so keep an eye out for those. In terms of interventions, episodic future thinking is a relatively easy intervention that's been shown to improve delay discounting, including among low-income mothers. So this will be very helpful. There's also quite a lot of evidence from behavioral economics that small changes in our environments can nudge people towards healthier choices, which are also helpful. However, there is nothing more effective than policy, excuse me. Across multiple studies, I've shown that even a small amount of money can improve the effects of food insecurity on reinforcer pathology. Increasing funding for assistance programs will help accomplish this, but why stop there? The groups most at risk for food insecurity are the sick and the elderly, and with the cost of healthcare in the United States, many of us are just one bad car accident away from food insecurity. Single-payer healthcare would eliminate that risk and not only lower the rates of food insecurity, but also help treat the diseases that are associated with it. We could go further, though, with universal basic income. Poverty does nothing to serve us and everything to harm us. Pilot studies of UBI have shown great promise. We could eliminate poverty altogether and simultaneously wipe away everything that I showed you today. All right, we're at the end, but get comfortable. I have a lot of people to thank, and I'll try to do it with minimal tears. I'll start with the money. I would like to thank NIDDK for supporting me through my training and this project. This work was also supported by the Mark Diamond Fund, the Department of Community Health and Health Behavior, and the Nutrition and Health Research Lab. The students who worked on this project deserve so much of the credit for all of their hard work to run these appointments. I couldn't get all of their pictures, but I hope they know that whether they were with me for 1 semester or 5, I couldn't have done it without them. I'd also like to thank my lab mates, too many to name, for helping me with the study and for creating a work environment where I could learn and grow and eat delicious food with great people. I also want to thank the whole department of CHHB who accepted me into this program, taught me so much, found space for us to do this research, and overall shaped my education. In particular, I owe a huge thanks to Drs. Oram, Leone, and Epstein. Dr. Oram has taught me so much about health disparities and helped me work on the theoretical background for this research. Dr. Leone welcomed me into her lab for 2 years and so that I could learn about how research is done in underserved communities. Dr. Epstein is a co-sponsor on my grant and helped me develop the ideas for this project to make it truly great. I also want to thank Dr. Naomi McKay for being such a wonderful friend and teaching me about cortisol, as well as Dr. Jen Philo for becoming my stats guru and friend. I have been fortunate to have many great mentors through all the years of school and work that I had, but when I met Dr. Jennifer Temple, who was to become my PhD mentor, she barely even interviewed me, guys. It felt like for reasons I truly didn't understand, she decided right away that I was capable of doing anything that I put my mind to, no matter how unrealistic or audacious an idea seemed to me. She just said, well, I'm sure you can figure it out. She has supported me and gone to bat for me again and again, no matter what I took on, including having 2 children while getting a PhD. Learning and growing in that environment of unwavering support that she created made me want to do more and try more things than I ever expected before, and allowed a confidence to grow that I never expected. And I'll never stop being grateful to her for that. Finally, for my family, I came into this world with immense privilege and had parents and grandparents, particularly my mother and grandmother, who planned for my education from the very beginning. And even though my dad was never interested in college for himself, he held on to that vision for them and for me and supported me through all of it. Next, of course, my husband has made many sacrifices for my education and has supported me in every way you can imagine. It's not enough to say that I'm grateful, but having him as my teammate is a dream come true. Finally, the real stars of my graduate education. These beautiful boys have quite literally been a part of me through this whole experience. They've made me a better scientist and a better person than I was when I started. And may we all find the joy and balance that they do when we eat. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take your questions.
All right. I don't know how now. I think people are clapping, but it also looks like maybe they're raising hands. I'm getting very confused by the graphics. So the way this will work, as you all probably know, is we will take questions from the general audience. And then once we have exhausted those questions, we'll take a mini break, and then her committee will stay on the Zoom and ask more detailed probing questions. So if anyone has a question, use the raise hand feature or try to wave me down.
I'm going to suggest that Amanda stop sharing her slides.
Sure, I suspected that. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
That helps. I still have 2 pages of people, but Naomi, are you clapping or raising your hand? Don't confuse me. Now you're on mute. Are you asking a question, Naomi? All right. I guess
So
not.
I'll start
Thanks, Claire.
by just complimenting Amanda on a masterful presentation of her dissertation research. I mean, think of all the literatures that you tried to bring together, the methodology. Very, very impressive.
Thank you.
I resonated with where you ended, which is policy. I mean, we keep playing these games around health disparities and all these other issues without recognizing possibly or calling out the policies that maintain them. I just asked for you to comment a little bit more on that issue.
I tried to get as like lightly political as I could. But I think there's a lot of misconceptions in the voting public about where poverty comes from and particularly how much control people have over it, which I think we know from looking at the research, it's fairly minimal. There are many programs out there that are absolutely helpful. I never want to detract from that. Our ability, like the student loan program and the Pell Grants and everything to help get people education, and the assistance programs that are out there, even though they are a little underfunded in many cases. So in the political climate, sometimes I think that we have to take what we can get to a certain extent, and we should do that. But I think having more and more conversations about these other ideas and the evidence for them, I just think is really important, particularly one-on-one and probably not on the internet.
Thank you.
I'm looking for more hands.
I have a question. I don't know how to raise my hand, but I was trying to. So this is that was a big picture question. This is kind of smaller picture, but I was interested in the result that the parents' food insecurity was predictive of RRV, but not the adolescents and kids. And certainly appreciate your explanation that kids may be sheltered from the food insecurity and be less aware of it. But I was also wondering about any methodological considerations. So if the task had to do with financial gains and losses, and you talked about at the beginning how kids have less of kind of access to their own money and maybe less awareness of what a financial loss and gain means. So just a question, I guess, as to whether in your experience, the task kind of functioned the same way across the age groups and the experience of doing it in kids this age. And if you think there, could be other alternative ways to assess RRV in your age groups.
So that gives me a great opportunity to talk about my postdoc, where I'm going to be learning about how this is measured in infants, which I know many know from seeing Dr. Kong's research. So there certainly are behavioral ways to see what kids will do, but we know that even infants do tend to understand, I do this thing, I get this food, and we see differences. When it comes to delayed discounting, though, we certainly had the concern that thinking about those comparisons between amounts of money might be a little difficult for the younger age group. And we did, as I know, we can look for non-systematic responding. So if people were kind of clicking randomly, we're able to pull those people out, which we did. And we're still seeing those expected age differences with the kids. So methodologically, it seemed like they were understanding, but didn't seem to change their behavior based on the manipulation.
If anyone else has a question and doesn't know how to raise their hand, they can just shout it out. It's not like we're talking over each other. So. I don't know whether it's good. Like, is it just you were so
it's just
clear?
So clear.
That's fine.
I was going to say my question for the private part, but even adding on to Stephanie's question, what about the food security measure? Is that we're using the same measure in kids and as in parents, and how did that? I guess I was wondering whether kids can answer, or the children, not the adolescents, but the children can answer as well as the parents can, or what you saw there.
So we had 2 surveys to choose between, because there is one that's been used in Venezuela, actually, to measure food insecurity in kids. And it has questions that are a little bit more, just a little easier for a kid to answer. Like, when you open the fridge, is there often not a lot of food? Things like that are easier for them to see than to consider their household finances. Even with that, we still didn't see very much food insecurity at all with the kids, too little for me to even justify analyzing it. However, Cindy Leung, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, she's at University of Michigan, and she looks at food insecurity in kids using interviews. And I do think that's a much stronger way to get at what the kids are directly experiencing, and probably better than the questionnaires that we used.
Any other questions? Okay. No one else has any questions? We can, I don't know how to kick everyone out. I think everyone's gonna have to voluntarily leave, except for her committee, who cannot leave. But you can leave for a short break, but you have to come back.
Me? Okay.
No, you can leave. Well, everyone that has to stay can leave, but don't shut off your Zoom.
Okay. Thank you for coming, everybody. I appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now, if that works for you guys.
Yeah.